Welcome to Wear Your Cape to Work, a podcast hosted by Project Insight. We believe that project and program managers are the real superheroes of every organization. We want you to hear their stories so you can be inspired to wear your own cape to work. Have you ever wondered what it's like to work at NASA? Today on Wear Your Cape to Work, we're talking with Jeffrey Connor, a NASA project manager with 43 years of experience managing high-stakes space program projects. He'll talk to us about his work with the shuttle program and launch pad operations, payload project management, and even the Columbia recovery. Jeff takes us back to a time before project management software even existed, when NASA projects were managed on the phone or in in-person meetings. His superpower? Seeing risks not as something to be afraid of, but as a chance to be precisely excellent. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us on today's podcast. We're so happy to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm excited to be here and interested to see how this goes.
Yeah, I really want to tell our audience that you are my second cousin, so this is special for me to have you on the show. I wanted to let everyone know that Jeff, when I was a young girl, he lived in Florida with my great uncle and the rest of their family, and we would travel. It was so exciting to travel to Florida at that time, right? I think we flew one time. That was such a monumental occasion, and we drove the other times, and we were excited to visit you because the weather was warm. We were driving from Wisconsin, and we were going to visit, Disney World was usually part of those trips. And my great uncle was working on the Air Force side of the physical standards lab at the NASA base. And we would hear stories about how he worked at the launch pad, and he would tell us that it was his job to light the rockets or light the spaceships or light whatever it was.
Light the fuse.
Yes, light the fuse. And we believed as little kids that he worked down there and he had a match and he would light it up and light that rocket and it was going to go into outer space. And he had, I think, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but he used to tell us he had to run really fast after he lit the rocket.
Course.
So that was a great story. And I think I held on to that in my imagination, probably even into my adult years, of what my great Uncle Sam was doing, at that launch pad. But you grew up with him as your dad, and he was there, and that work that he was doing, in all of the coordinating of that physical standards project work or testing. You explained to me what he was actually doing, but what was it like to have him there at NASA?
Well, for me, it was just normal because he was working at Martin before that. In the machinist lab at Martin Marietta, and then he got laid off there and then got a job at the physical standards lab at the Air Force side of the Kennedy Space Center. And for me, that was 68, I think it was. And so for me, that was just normal. He just always worked there, and that's what he did. And once a year or so, we would get to go out and go to an open house. So we got to see everything that was at the Space Center, and not the NASA side, but the Air Force side. So it was just normal life for me.
You just went down to the Space Center like it was Dad's office. That's cool.
Yeah, that's cool.
And then we also grew up as a kid in elementary school. We were there when they were launching Apollo or Mercury and Gemini. And then later on Apollo, we were, my father was already working at the Space Center. Mm-hmm. And so even the schools, when they got ready to launch Mercury, they let us all out. We'd stand outside the school and watch it because you could see it from Orlando on a clear day.
Oh, wow.
And so it was just part of life in Orlando. And so it's always been part of my life.
That is so special. Is that what led you to that path? I mean, work?
No, I needed a job, and that was a good place to get a job. Mm-hmm. And it was, long term. And so that was a good place to go.
Yeah, that's neat. What was your first role when you got over to NASA?
I was an associate engineer. I just graduated from the University of Central Florida with an mechanical engineering degree. And when you go in out of college, then you're an associate engineer. So I was doing standard interface documents at the time. And a standard interface document is a set of drawings. Back in those days, they really did drawings. They were Mylar drawings with ink. And so These are drawings of all of the processing facilities for the space shuttle. And these would go out to the payload customers, and they would show where the locations were for all the electrical interfaces, all the fluid interfaces, and all the gas interfaces in the facility, and gave the information for all of that so that they knew when they were building their payloads what resources were available to them for testing or keeping the payload in a condition that they wanted it at for all the facilities as they moved around. So for me as a young engineer, I'm 25 and I'm out there and I have access to every one of the facilities. And so I could walk anywhere and look at anything. And so that was a great place to start because I learned all the facilities. My rest of my 42 years out there at the Space Center, I already knew the operating for, the OPF, Orbiter Processing Facility, or the ONC, Operations and Checkout Facility, and the Vertical Processing Facility. I knew all those because I'd walked around there just every day. That's just what I did. I would
That
walk
was
around
your
and look at
life.
the,
Yeah, that
look
sounds
at
really
the,
fun and cool. I mean, most of us mere mortals, we would love to be able to just run around
I
the
know.
space center.
Yeah,
That's
I just,
amazing.
okay, I'm going to go to this facility today and then look around and see what's changed. And so
Mhm.
that's a great job. And
So cool. Can you tell our audience just a little bit, since not everybody is familiar with all of the terms, but you've already mentioned payload. And I know we're going to use that a lot during today's conversation because you did quite a bit with this. But what is the payload and how does that reference the space shuttle and the efforts and that you were a
well,
part of?
for the space shuttle and most other um, rocket ships, um, you go into space. Well, you have to take something into space, and that's what essentially the
Mhm.
space shuttle was built for. It has a very large payload bay with the
Mhm.
doors that open up in the center between the front and the tail.
Mhm.
There's a big cargo bay in there, and I think it's 66 feet. I don't remember. It's been a while since I've worked all this, and so it's very large. So you have to put things in it to go up into space, and either they're satellites or they're, in this case, a lot of the payloads that I worked when I was a payload project engineer and a manager was for space station. So we were there. I was there working the first few payloads that built the space station, the first elements that started building it, and I worked that all the way through to the end of the shuttle program. Is basically putting up parts for the space station.
So let's just think about this. Everyone
Mhm.
who's listening is thinking, okay, the station in space has to have all of that equipment brought up and assembled there, and someone has to be part of that project management where you're deciding, okay, what goes up first and what do you need and what goes up second and
Mhm.
how did that happen?
Um, a lot of effort. It takes a lot of people and a lot of time. And as a payload project manager, when I was working that, um, we would usually start working a payload about a year in advance to it actually flying. And of course, the payload customer has been working this for years and years, building it. And then we get together a year before we launch and we have an integration CIR, so a cargo integration review uh, in Houston. And all of the stakeholders, all of the people that were involved in the payload, and then also the space shuttle itself and the launching system, we would all get together in Houston and we would have a week-long meeting and go over what the payload was, what its goals were, what we were supposed to do as part of processing, because there was always some final processing that needed to be done before we put it into the vehicle. And then what the requirements were. There's always an interface between the payload itself and the vehicle, the space shuttle. So there's always requirements. The payload has certain requirements that it needs. It might be fluids or electrical or
Mhm.
locations or whatever. A lot of purge. We talk purge a lot. Basically,
Hmm.
for the people just listening, that's just air conditioning, but
Okay.
it is very important to spacecraft because it keeps things dry, it keeps things at a certain temperature and clean, and those are the three
Oh,
things.
dry.
Cleanliness is probably as important as the keeping it dry, and So once it starts getting condensation on it, that now becomes FOD, and then so we want to get rid of that. So we need to dry it out. So water and spacecraft don't go together real well.
Now, did you guys end up having, when the vendor or whomever was putting a payload in there, did you ever have a problem where like, oh, you guys have this issue, or wasn't quite to spec on this or that?
Yeah, that, and most of the payloads we put in out at the pad itself. So
Yeah.
it was a vertical installation. So there was a large
Oh,
canister
wow.
that simulated the size of the payload bay that was on the shuttle, and it would be taken out to the pad on a transporter in a vertical configuration, and then lifted up to the pad, and then attached to the PCR, or the payload changeout room, and then the payload was installed into the payload changeout room, and then the canister was removed, and then the payload changeout room, a huge structure, would roll around on the pad itself until it mated back up with the space shuttle. The space shuttle would open its doors inside the PCR, and then the payload would be transferred into the vehicle itself. And it was a massive effort. We're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds, and very critical spacecraft items, and I don't want a lot of vibration. Everything has to line up perfectly, to a thousandth of an inch, to get attach bolts in place and things like that. So it was a big operation, and those guys that worked at the pad were amazing, and they were very, very motivated. So it was easy working with people like that. And as is most of the people at the Space Center, they're all motivated they're going to space, and this is what we do,
Yeah.
and we love it, and we're proud of it. And
Yeah.
so motivating them as a project manager, it was easy. You just go have a meeting
Right.
and say, this is what we need to do, and this is how we need to do it. And they go,
Yeah.
okay, but maybe we should do it this way. And you go, okay, that meets the requirement. Let's go do it. And they were great.
That's good to know. I mean, not a lot, sometimes that's a topic that we talk about all the time in our professional series, like how do you motivate your team and keep them all excited. But if you're putting things in space, you're saying that your team is always really motivated.
Yeah, well, we were in this case, typically we were building the space station, so everyone
Yeah.
was motivated. And I wanted to point out, even now, I take the garbage out to the road at night, and occasionally the space station flies
Yes.
over, and I get to
Yeah.
watch it go over, and I go, I helped build that thing.
I
So
That's pretty
helped
cool.
build that. That's so amazing. And wait, I need to back up a minute because I'm imagining all of that, in that space that they're setting the payload in just right. Did you say it's inserted into the shuttle when it's already vertical?
that's correct.
Oh
When
my
it's out at the
goodness.
pad. We don't have any visuals to kind of show that,
Yeah.
but that's how we did it.
Yeah, that is really neat for our audience. So think about it. You've got the shuttle is ready to go into space, so it's aiming
hmm
into the air, and all of this is inserted, not even you can't even walk in there and do it. It's got to all be inserted
Well, then
to
you got to
this.
push it in laterally, horizontally, pushed it back, right? That makes
Right.
it extra hard, I'm sure, because if you can just drop it on top, it might be a little simpler.
Yeah, there were some payloads like Space Hab were put in horizontally in the orbiter processing facility. So that was pretty standard. The vehicle is horizontal. You pick up the Space Hab, you pick it up, you carry it over, you set it down. Gravity's working with you instead of against you. And those were a lot simpler, but we didn't have many of those when I was working as a project manager.
So you did some other things besides just the payload project engineering. Your first you started there in 81. Was that when you first were
Yes,
working?
I
Okay.
started in 81 on my birthday.
Oh,
I,
that's so
I
great.
had graduated from UCF and got a job out there with one of the subcontractors.
So was that
And
before the first shuttle launch or after?
No, I missed the first shuttle launch. That was in
Mm-hmm.
81. I think the first shuttle launch was in April or March of 81. So I watched it from the
Yeah.
university, and pretty exciting. But I was there for the second one. So.
Yeah. Well, I remember the first one because I was 9 at the time, and I can remember even where I was and all that because, I mean, with
Mhm.
Trina and I are about the same age. When we grew up, it was all space, for that whole entire
Mhm.
decade
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
our first first decade.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
big and everybody loved it. And
Yeah.
everybody wanted to talk to you about it. And when I was traveling overseas, everyone wanted to talk about Columbia and the space
Hmm.
shuttle and what they were doing.
Hmm.
So it was pretty
So
exciting.
your first
Yeah.
role then after, the beginnings, it looked like you took on the role of shuttle landings operations. Were you managing all of the landing operation then? Was that your lead for
Well,
that?
there were 8 of us that were landing operations test directors. And essentially, it's a project management position, but in those days, they didn't call them project managers. And so there were, I think, 4 or 5 of us that were certified for level 1 for doing shuttle landings at either KSC or out at Edwards Air Force Base in California.
Yeah.
And so I was one of those 5. I think there was 5.
So did you have to go out to, I mean, I remember we also, being from California, went out to see the shuttle land in
Yeah.
Edwards, in the desert out there early in the morning.
I went out there for a couple missions, but it never landed when I was there. I did all my landings at KSC at the Space Center in Florida. 26 landings I did there. And typically that was after for launch. A lot of times I would go to one of the emergency landing sites in Spain or in Africa, sometimes in Guam or Hawaii, and then come back and then have to do the landing too. So there was just enough of us to go everywhere in the world for launch, and then we all had to hurry, come back, and then cover all the sites in the
Mhm.
United States and be prepared for the landing or the emergency landings in the United States. So yeah, it kept us busy. It was a fun
Well,
time.
you and I spoke just the other day. I'm only bringing this up because you just mentioned that this was really before that title of project manager was very popular. Like it was out there, but it wasn't being used across things. And also before project management software was really managing projects like this. And I teased you. I was like, well, what were you guys using back in the day? And it wasn't even really spreadsheets. We were just meeting. Maybe you can describe what that was like in these early days before you could automate this task being sent to someone.
Yeah, back in the late 80s and 90s when I was doing landing operations, yeah, it was schedules, printed schedules. A lot of everything was printed. Not much was on computers in the last half of the 90s. Then we started to get a little more, but not everybody had a computer. And so everything was still essentially sent by mail, by courier, back and forth. We had a system at the Space Center that you would put paper into a big envelope and write the guy's name and address on it and set it in the box, and there was somebody who would come by twice a day, pick it up, and they would distribute it, and it would show up at somebody else's desk later on that day or first thing in the morning. So that's how we moved things around and schedules. We had lots of meetings, and and the other thing too, as we discussed, um, you would either pick up the phone and call an
Hmm.
individual and say, I need this, or this is what we need to do. And we would talk it out. Or you would just get up and go to the next building or the
Yes.
other facility. You'd drive in a car and you'd sit down at their desk and you would work out how we're going to do this. We have a problem or we have something we need to get done, or we need people to do this particular
Mhm.
job. I need these people, or I need this type of people.
Hmm.
And you just go to their desk and talk to them. And that's the way it was in the 80s and at least most of the 90s.
I'm finding myself like in two camps. Like that sounds really appealing, this pace of work at which you meet and we talk and we collaborate about these things, and the next person by human receives their next assignment, all of that. And then it also sounds like, wow, that had to slow things down just a little bit compared to what we're used to now and how quickly you can accomplish things. What are your feelings about that?
Um, I'm like you, I have mixed feelings because
Hmm.
now we're overloaded with emails
Yeah.
and messages and
Mhm.
and so you can't keep up because when I was the last couple of years when I was working, you come in and you were looking at emails or answering emails or sending stuff out for two
Hmm.
hours when you first get to work. And
Hmm.
I didn't have that problem when I was there in the 80s.
Yeah.
You would call someone up and you would talk to them directly and you would get an answer and we would agree and then we would write it down and then we would agree to it and then we would move forward.
Right, maybe work moved at the same speed as people moved, you know?
Yeah, I don't know if we're any faster now than we were then, but
Yeah,
but we
something
certainly
like
have. We
that.
certainly talk a lot more. We sent a lot more emails.
Back then, you said you sent more emails, or you got on the phone a lot more.
I got on the phone a lot
Yeah,
more, and now we send a lot of emails. So I
right.
don't know if it's any better or not.
Well,
And
I
you said a
definitely
lot
agree
of
that.
meetings.
Oh yes,
Yeah, I definitely agree. The emails can be a big challenge if you're gonna. I mean, it's something that we as project managers should be mindful of. Is like don't over send emails because you do create extra work that way.
it's kind of hard. It's I think the momentum is against us at this point.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And even the notifications, right? To be notified that you have a project that's, either started or it's overdue
Mm-hmm.
or it's your turn to work on it. Your task is up in this queue. But what were your shuttle landings, and then from there you went to NASA Air Boss, where you were part of the helicopter search and recovery for Challenger. Is that right?
Yeah, the Columbia accident uh, in what 2003, I think it was. Yeah, I went out to Texas, and my assigned duty was to be the air boss for 25 helicopters at Lufkin Airport. And so I worked with it was actually two of the astronauts. They were the air chief, and they would rotate back and forth. And then I was the air boss for a month. I took over for another guy that had actually set up the air helicopters before me, within days after the accident. And they started bringing in helicopters to use. They were all leased. They would hire the helicopter along with the pilot, from all over the United States. So they flew in, and they would come and set up, and then we would assign a NASA person or two to ride in the helicopter that were experts on the vehicle itself. They could tell whether a piece of debris that you found on the ground was actually a piece of the shuttle or just something that happened to be there. And so that was why they were there. They were there to identify them, and then if there was some issues, those guys were um, experts on the vehicle itself and whether there was an issue with hazards or contamination or something that you don't want to touch that, leave it alone, let's back off. We'll bring in a decontamination team, which we didn't have a lot of that, at least with the helicopters. The guys that were in Hemp Hill and they were walking aground, they ran into more of that because of the heavier items with the after the vehicle were farther down range, and so they ran into that more than we did. Our items were a lot lighter.
That sounds like a somber role at that time. Did it feel
Yes,
like
it
that?
was.
Hmm.
Well, yes, it was, but we knew what we were doing and it had to be done, and we were excited to get it done. We wanted to do our
Hmm.
best. We were
Mm-hmm.
all still looking for that, the smoking gun. We were looking for that piece that we found that would answer the question, what happened? And it wasn't one piece that really did it. There was a bunch of pieces that were put together, and then all of us that were in Texas, uh, when we were finding debris, and we'd bring it back, and it would get picked up, and it would be taken back to the Air Force Base, and then it would be brought back down to the Space Center. And then they had another team at the Space Center. They were reassembling the vehicle on the ground, trying to put it back together to determine what they were doing. Essentially, what the NTSB does when they do an aircraft crash, they reassemble the vehicle, trying to determine why it failed or what happened at the time. And so we were doing that. So we were all excited about doing it, and we all wanted to find the one piece that answered the question.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you know this, but when I was there, the one helicopter that crashed, that was one of mine. And
Oh,
so
okay.
we lost the pilot, and then the
Oh.
Texas Forest Service also had a person on each helicopter. They were the helicopter manager. There was a pilot typically that owned the helicopter or worked for the company that owned it, and then there was a Texas Forest Service representative that was also on the helicopter, and then we had one or two NASA people that would ride also in the back, and typically two, so you could look out both sides of the helicopter to look for debris. And so when that helicopter essentially, the short story is the fuel control system shut off. And so it just fell out of the sky. The engine just shut off, and they were 100 feet sitting still, checking their where the location was. They were 100 feet above
Mm.
80-foot trees. The engine shut off. By the time you fell 20 feet, you're already in the trees. So it killed both the
Mm.
pilot and the
Yeah, that's
Texas Forest
terrible.
Service. Yeah, not good. But we recovered from that too, and we carried on.
Well, I mean, when you do something really risky, you're gonna, it's not. It's you want to have zero accidents, but that's just not possible to in life.
Well, it's all part of space program. As far
Hmm.
as I'm concerned, it's unfortunate that it happens, but it is a dangerous world.
The shuttle, I mean, nowadays they're launching and they expect the rockets to blow up. We're just going to learn and we're going to use remote control. But I believe that Young and I forget who the other astronaut, they had to test fly the shuttle without anybody ever really flying it other than the Enterprise landing vehicle. So those guys have got to be super brave.
They were both test pilots, so they had been flying test aircraft for years and years. That's what they did. And so they were used to that. They knew the risk and they knew how to minimize it. And you're correct that the first time the space shuttle flew off of the launch pad was the first time it ever flew off the launch pad. So they weren't really sure how everything was going to work. And and also as you indicated, and Enterprise was a landing test vehicle, so they had done lots of drop tests with the Enterprise out at Edwards. So they understood the characteristics and what would go wrong with flying
Mm.
it and bringing it down and landing it, which was the real critical part.
Hmm.
Launching really wasn't, even though the dynamics are always working against you. Um, they pretty well understand how the vehicle flies and when it goes up into space. But yeah, it was the first time. You're right about that.
So in these cases where you have to have almost I mean, basic
Perfect.
perfection. I mean, you spoke of that, and how people to the thousandth of a millimeter or whatever you were mentioning, the near perfect projects, zero failure and super high risk of that. What was that like? Tell us about, how people faced those challenges.
Looking from the outside, you would think that this is really stressful, and it was in a way, but it was the world that we lived in. It was the world we worked in, and we accepted that, just like the astronauts did. They accepted the risk, and we were building the vehicle that the astronauts were flying on, and we knew the astronauts because they would come to the Space Center. They would see us. They would talk with us. We would talk with them. We would confer with them on things. They would just come and see, because this was the vehicle they were riding in
Yeah.
and they were flying. They wanted to know how we were assembling it. And we knew them. And so we did not want to be the person that did the thing wrong that caused them
Hmm.
Hmm.
for the mission to not go well or to lose one of the astronauts, or in some cases many astronauts flying the shuttle. So everyone was aware of that, and we all knew it, and we all accepted it, and everyone to the person tried their best to not. It was not going to be my system. It was not going to be the work that I did that was going to cause an issue with the vehicle or a possibility of losing the crew. And that was a philosophy across the board. Everyone that touched flight hardware, that was always their philosophy.
I'm getting a really cool vibe of this is just about excellence more than, like you said, stress or fear. I'm striving for this absolute excellence, and this commitment to that took precedence over let's identify all these risks. But some of, I think you said in your LinkedIn profile, it says that you're really great at identifying some of those potential, failure possibilities or where are the problems? Where are the struggles going to be? Is that always come naturally to you to see what might get in the way or?
It seemed to come natural,
Mhm.
or more so, as I worked out at the Space Center, and I continued to move up and do different things. So yeah, I always look ahead. I seem to be more of an operations person than I was an engineer. Even though I thought I wanted to be an engineer, the operations was definitely the place that worked well for me. And that's essentially operations is what eventually turned into project management.
Yeah, talk
Right.
about that a little bit. How did you see that come, in your work or around you in other corporations maybe or your vendors?
Um, we were doing project management before project management. So, operations is that's you're always looking ahead. You have to get the people together, the hardware, the equipment. You have to get the procedures together and move forward and agree that we're all doing the right thing at the right time and working together. And there's levels of operations as we move forward out, moving forward being to the launch pad, the launch. And the closer you get to the launch pad, the more people that are involved and the more scrutiny you have on everything. So it's important when you're back at the facilities that are assembling the payload or assembling the vehicle or getting everything ready before we go to the launch pad, that everything is perfect uh, there, so that
I
when we
see.
get to the launch pad, we don't have other problems that we can't
Mm,
fix.
I mean, is the complexity just going to continue to pile up as you go, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, and you can't get the things. So you assemble. For
Hmm.
example, you put the engines in, which I wasn't involved in, but you put the engines in the space shuttle and you put it at the pad. Well, you can't get to the engines, so it's very difficult to get those
oh,
out.
I see. Right.
And it's the same thing with OMS pods or thrusters or
Mm.
internal parts. Sometimes you just can't get to them, and there was a lot of time spent with the space shuttle program scratching their heads trying to figure out how to get to items that are inside the vehicle without having to roll back to the VAB and destack to be able to get to it. So, and those guys, the the engineers that were at the pad, a lot of those were the payload engineers and technicians that I was talking about earlier. They were amazing. The pickboard crew that would put in pickboards to get the stuff, they were amazing. They could get you anywhere. If you could point to it, they could get you a platform so you could get there. And they were just amazing to work with for all those years.
And so were you responsible in your later career there? You had a title of transportation engineer. Is that part of those projects, moving everything from one place to the launch pad? Is that what that's about?
No, the transportation engineer was after shuttle ended, and that was on the Orion program, the Artemis program, I think they call it now. But with the Orion spacecraft, I was working for a subcontractor for Lockheed, and we were transporting Orion hardware, either the vehicle itself or some of the hardware around the country, so that they could assemble it and test it. Or I brought the EFT1 to KSC. It was one of my last transportation jobs, and
Okay.
that's the CM structure itself for the first launch that we had that was unmanned. It was a test flight, and we flew that on a Delta, I think it was, on the Cape side. And
Okay.
so I would transport that. But again, that followed along with the same things. Looking ahead
Yes.
all the time, you have to get permits and to travel across different states and on different roads because our hardware was always extra wide, extra tall, and
Yes.
extra heavy.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
In the way of regular traffic, right?
yes, always in the way of regular traffic. So
Yeah.
yeah, that always took a lot of effort and time, and it was
Mhm.
so new that all management always wanted to know exactly. So we were always
Oh,
doing
I see.
pitches and
Mhm.
putting together plans for them to read to make sure that we knew what we were doing, while they were
So lots
making
of
sure we knew.
reporting.
Yes,
Yes, our audience is, we all know everyone
Yeah.
needs to report up to the C-suite. They're going to want to know what's going on and they want to know it fast and they want to know it accurate and they want to know how it's impacting all the bottom lines of everything.
Right. So you got to do that on top of actually getting the work done. How many
correct.
team members were involved in some of the projects you ran,
For transportation
or
or
anything
just
along the
over.
way?
Well, when I was doing landing operations, when I do landing operations at the Kennedy Space Center for the end of mission landings, there was upwards to 200 people that were on the
Mhm.
runway at one time or another
Wow.
Yeah.
doing work. So
Wow.
it was a big operation and very hazardous because the vehicle had
Mhm.
just come from space. There was a lot of commodities still on board,
Mm.
thrusters possibly
Hmm.
leak. when it first lands, there's raw ammonia coming out for cooling the
Oh.
internal electronics. There's a
Mm-hmm.
system involved that sprays ammonia onto a cold plate. And as the
Oh, wow.
ammonia evaporates and goes out of vent, then it cools down the electronic or the cooling system in there. So that was floating around in the atmosphere, so you had to watch that. Sometimes the thrusters would be leaking, and we'd have to take care of that. But for the most part, the landings were good. There weren't very many big problems, and we just went through the process. It took about 3 to 8 hours out on the runway to get the vehicle in a proper configuration to tow it off the runway. And so it took a lot of people to do that. Not all of them were out on the runway at the same time, but upwards to 100 people at a time would be out on the runway for sure.
Right. I mean, and that's just one part of a mission.
Right.
We're talking about,
Right.
and we all know that, or not everybody knows, but the shuttle. There's one chance to land this thing
Mm-hmm.
every time. That's got to be stressful. Just not. I mean, and especially if they're going to try to go to I think Edwards is wide open, whereas Kennedy's got more limitations on how much space you have.
Well, we had one runway, but it was 15,000 feet wide. It was 300 feet wide. So it was plenty big for the vehicle to land on. And they have electronic navigational systems along with the visual landing aid system. So the vehicle had the capability to land itself, but the crew always wanted to fly it. There was always a big discussion about the transition. If the vehicle's flying itself and then it has a problem, and then the pilot or the commander has to take over, there's that few seconds where the commander's trying to get a feel for the vehicle that he just took over, and there really wasn't a lot of a free time to kind of a little left, a little right, a little up, down. No, you had to be right on the money for the whole landing, because you're always dissipating your energy, so you don't want to use up too much. So they finally agreed and decided that the crew would fly in all the time, and then they would use the other navigational systems or the automatic landing system as a backup. And so they always landed on their own, which I don't disagree with, but it sure was stressful. But they did it, and that's what they do, and they do it very well.
Okay, so part of what our podcast is all about is the superhero powers or skills or capabilities that project managers really bring to their role at organizations. And, I haven't been able to talk to you about all these at length at times, but I can feel from you this ability to view risk as something that's exciting and a challenge, something to solve, something to, navigate through and do really well. Would you say that that's one of your project management superpowers? Is there something else that you feel like has always come natural to you?
As far as the risk, I've always been good at looking ahead and seeing what the risks are. And that's important as a project manager, to be able to see what's coming and look ahead to determine what would cause your project to fail. What is it going to keep the people from being able to do it? Whether it's people or hardware or schedule or weather or whatever that is, and look ahead. And then as you're doing that, I know with project management, they formalize it to write it all down. But as you identify these things, you go talk with people, and how can we minimize this? How can we minimize the issue with the weather or humidity or getting this hardware on time? This thing failed and we need to get another piece in to replace it. How can we get another one? What can we do to meet the schedule and continue on? So there's always a lot of talk about that with people. And that was in the old days. That's where you got up out of your desk and you went to the other facility, you sat down with someone and you talked with them. Now we do it in meetings, or we send emails, and we do it that way. But it's always to identify those and minimize them and have them in your back pocket for a lot of things. This could happen. What if this happens? What will we do to fix it? And already have that as a kind of a tentative plan in place that either or at least part of your team, your leaders know that this is what we're going to do if these things happen.
Having a plan B or C or D or
X, Y, Z. A lot of times.
Did you get to the second layer of alphabet, right?
Yeah, and the bigger the project gets, the wider your
Mm.
scope of issues and problems that you have to work
Mm-hmm.
through and be ready for. You have your schedule and it's laid out. It may take 3 or 4 pages for all the pieces to fall in, but what are the
Mm-hmm.
other things that could impact those, and try to minimize them, look ahead to make sure that they're done early, or we have a backup plan at least to go fix those.
And how often would you kind of regroup and say, is the plan still moving the direction that we think it's moving, or do we need to pivot or change something or make a adjustment?
Well, with the payload project manager, we had a meeting every week. The whole
Mm.
team got together every week,
Mm-hmm.
and we had people that tied in from the other centers,
Okay.
and we would always talk through where we're at, where we're going. Is all the paper ready? Everything we worked on at the Space Center with spacecraft had to have paper, and it had to be approved.
Mm.
And so is the paper ready? Next week we're going to do this part of the assembly, or this installation we're going to do. Is the paper ready?
Oh, yeah. Is the
And
paper ready?
is the
Mm-hmm.
That's the
paper ready?
approval,
Or
basically,
no, that's the procedure.
the
And so you had
Okay.
to get
documentation.
the documentation. So you
Hmm.
had to be able to make sure that everybody's read it, everybody's signed off on it, it's all
Hmm.
ready to go. Do you have everything? And then get it to the technicians so that they read it and they understand it
Mm-hmm.
before we do
Mm-hmm.
the project,
Were were
do the
the
installation.
schedules realistic most of the time, or did you ever have any challenges where you had to get more time, or couldn't
Uh,
meet what the expectation was from the higher level?
well, the schedules are always too tight.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's what I'm
Always.
going.
Yeah, exactly.
You always want more time. But the
Yeah,
problem is if you have more time, then people aren't focused
yeah.
on
Mm.
doing it, and they do
Mm-hmm.
other things. And as a
Hmm.
project manager, most of these people are doing other things. You bring them in to do the specific task in your project. And so if you're not using them for that, they wander off to something else, or they do something else. So you got to keep them all focused on that. So
So you're advocating for a permanently tight schedule to keep
Yes.
people focused, but
Urgent.
um, uh, yeah, slightly more tight,
mhm.
and work in that direction. So, but the bigger part was just that the schedule was realistic
Yeah.
and flowed well.
Mhm.
And with us, we had space shuttle for 30 years. So after
Yeah.
10 years, you got pretty good at it. And those
Mhm.
guys that were putting over the integrated schedule were very good at it. And I was pretty good at doing my payload schedules and keeping those in line. And so I was just one project manager and a myriad of many project managers doing different pieces. And so we would work together. And so we had um, weekly payload meetings. And then once we got to the VAB, the vehicle got into vertical configuration, then we started integrating with the launch team. Then we had daily meetings. Every morning at 9 o'clock was a integrated scheduling meeting for going to the pad or at the pad. And we talked everything. Well, payloads was just one small part
Mhm.
of all the pieces that had to be done out at the pad.
Right.
And the launch director and his team, they did a fantastic job, always keeping ahead of that. And I got called on the floor once or twice because we were not where we
Yeah.
were supposed to be. So
Mm.
we would go fix it,
Mm-hmm.
and we would catch back up and be where we
Mhm.
were supposed to be in the schedule.
That's so cool. Do you have a favorite thing that you have been a part of, or a project that you did, or just something that you remember so fondly about your time there?
Wow, it was big, but the the payload project management was really big because
Mhm.
we were building the space station, so
Yeah.
Yeah.
you
That
could see
sounds
it.
cool.
You watch the vehicle launch, and then you see it go up, and you watch it on TV,
So cool.
or NASA TV out at the Space Center. We could watch it being assembled, and you could watch the
Wow.
space station fly over occasionally. You could see
Yeah.
it fly by, and
Mm-hmm.
so it was pretty impressive. The other one that I liked as part of my career was when I was landing operations, and it was really a hard one to give up because not only were we landing the vehicle on the runway, It was in space. An hour ago it was in space, and here it sits in front of me right now. And I was the closest vehicle when it rolled to a stop, and so here it is. It's making all kinds of funny noises, and it was just in space, and the crew's inside, and things are going, and we have a lot of things to do to make it safe. That was pretty exciting. Plus the sub part of that was I got to travel around the world all the time. So if we had 6 or 8 launches a year, I was traveling somewhere 6 or 8 times a year, sometimes more. Sometimes we had to go for other maintenance things or some other issues.
Well, where were the other sites that the shuttle landed on besides Kennedy and Edwards?
Those are the two. It landed once at White Sands in
Yeah.
New Mexico. So those are the 3 sites that the vehicle only landed at.
Where
And
were the other places it may have had to go that it never
now
went to?
there were emergency landing sites that were manned up for
Yeah.
launch itself, and there was 2 in Spain, one in Zaragoza, and one outside of Sevilla, Spain, Morón Air Base. Those were 2 sites in Spain. We used Rota for about 6 months while Morón was being repaved, but again, we went back to Morón Air Base whenever the runway was fixed. There was a site in Casablanca or outside of Marrakesh in Morocco that we supported for launch, and then that site would also stay up for the whole mission. We had a site that was in Dakar. That was the first transatlantic landing site for about STS 2 or 3, somewhere around there, and that was up. But we moved it from Dakar a little bit farther south to Gambia, to Banjul, Gambia. So that was another site. That was one of my sites that I was responsible for. I actually moved all the equipment from Dakar to Banjul, overrode in Africa. That's another story on itself. and and then set up the site there. So we used the runway in Banjul. Great people, great country. They really supported us, and they spoke English, so that helped out too. And then there was a mission support site that was in Guam. I set up that site initially, and that would stay up for the whole mission. That wasn't necessarily a landing site for a launch. And then there was another site at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii that was set up as a mission support site there. After I left landing operations in 2000, I think they set up another emergency landing site in France outside of Marseille. So I wasn't part of that one. So that one supported a lot of the last missions, say maybe the last 5 years or so.
I'm just
Yeah,
sitting
sounds
here.
complex.
Yeah,
Yes.
complex. And also, 43 years, did you say, was the amount of
Yes,
time that you were with them?
43.
I think that our audience, like me, is listening and saying, wow, he has been a part of so much and such diverse projects in different areas and all over the globe. And, the fact that you found it so rewarding and fulfilling, it seems like people are probably pretty envious of your exciting career.
It was nice, and I'm glad I get to hear a little bit of it. It was fun. I loved it. It was a good career.
Well, and it's obvious that, the strengths that you and your teams brought to all of this work that was being accomplished. I'm sure you've worked with thousands, if not more, incremental numbers of people who are just so talented and so intelligent and so excellent at the work that they do. I'm excited to learn today that the motivation was always high, and it sounds like that means also the rapport between people. And seems like such a terrific place to have had a career for all that time. So thank you so much for sharing about your experience there. I know our audience is going to be thrilled to hear about it and can connect with you, I presume, on LinkedIn if they'd like to follow you there. I don't know if you're active still, but I know
I
people will be
don't.
interested.
I'm not too active in LinkedIn since I'm not working. So
Yep. Oh, speaking of which, I did want to say the other day we spoke, and I think our audience would love to hear that you get together with colleagues from your time at NASA, and you guys have a little get together pretty frequently, once a week, once a month, something to reminisce.
I have a bunch of guys I meet up with once a week, and we talk about the Space Center and what's going on in spacecraft. We're really interested in Musk's Starship. I can hardly wait. We can hardly wait to see one fly here. Very interesting.
Are they, you mean from Kennedy or?
Yeah, from Kennedy. Yeah,
we watch them. Are they planning on one?
Yes. Well, eventually they're going to have to launch from here. They have launch. They've already set their launch pad up. It's out at 39A.
Oh, okay.
You can see it from Titusville. It's pretty tall, and so we're excited for them to launch from there. It'll be impressive.
Why do they have to launch from Florida versus the Texas facility?
It's a little farther east, and so you don't have the issue with debris going over, places where people live. Although I did see that they launched the last one from Boca Villa, and it came apart during launch, and there were a lot of pieces falling into the Bahamas area. So
that sounds dangerous.
The FAA was not happy with that. So I haven't heard what the outcome of that's going to be.
Well, I want to get your little group all T-shirts that say, "Is the paper ready?" I think
is the paper ready?
Yeah, is the paper ready? I kind of want a shirt myself, so I'm going to look into that because I think it might be fun. It would be a good conversation starter.
That's a good comment, because that was universal when we were working Columbia and the space shuttle. Is the paper ready? Because if the paper's not ready, we're not doing the work.
It would be a testament to when you were working in project management, or where, if you had that idea, is the paper ready? But I'm sure our audience is just fascinated by our time together. So thanks again, Jeff, for being with us today. We really appreciate you.
Thank you very much. This was very exciting. It brought back a lot of memories.
Thank you for joining us today on the Wear Your Cape to Work podcast, hosted by Project Insight. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, follow, or leave us a comment. If you subscribe to our YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or other favorite podcast channels, you'll receive notifications of all of our new episodes. We'd also love it if you would share Wear Your Cape to Work with your network of PMPs or anyone else who might enjoy the show. Project Insight is an online project and portfolio management software that helps companies connect project data from across all of their teams and software tools so that they can make confident decisions about their business. Our website is projectinsight.com, and there you can find many resources for project professionals, including free PDU webinars, as well as a place to register for a demonstration or a consultation with one of our success teams. Thank you once again for joining today's conversation, and most importantly, thanks for wearing your cape to work.